Welcome to the podcast, Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path. I'm your host, Mike Allen. There have been some pretty bad train wrecks in Connecticut history, but many folks point to the 1878 train wreck in the village of Tariffville as certainly one of the very worst. And that's northwest of Hartford, part of the town of Simsbury. It involved a train that cascaded off a bridge that had collapsed into the icy waters of the Farmington River on a frigid, cold January night. Killed and injured scores of people. It also involved the first use of a telephone in this country to summon help following a disaster. So you would call it more or less the first 911 call. Our guest today is Frank Haviland. He's on the board of the Tariffville Village Association, and he's studied the story of this train wreck thoroughly. He's going to be along in just a moment with a very vivid description of what happened. This week's trivia question, his name was Moses Yale Beach, and he created something that you make use of every day. What is it? Stick around after the main program for the answer, because then you're going to know the topic for next week's show. Well, of course, we still have train accidents today in the 21st century, but back in the 1800s, when trains were hitting their stride, we had a lot more accidents, and they were usually a lot worse. Thus was the case on a bitterly cold January 9th in the year 1878. Now, the date was January 15th, which was a Tuesday. It's kind of an unusual night for a train full of singing passengers to be making their way out of Hartford. But they were on a bit of a high. They were spiritually in a good mood because they'd just been to a religious revival in the capital city and now were heading home. Well, they got on that train, which had 2 engines, 8 passenger cars, a baggage car, and a caboose in Hartford, and were heading west across the hilly terrain of the northwest hills of Connecticut. Well, about an hour after they left, disaster would strike in a small village on the Farmington River called Tariffville. Now, it's a village in the northeast corner of the town of Simsbury. Tariffville had its own train station in the day, and that accident occurred shortly after the train had pulled out of that station and was headed for the wooden bridge that went over the Farmington River, a bridge with 2 sections that carried those railroad tracks over the water. Well, the train wouldn't make it to the other side, and on one of the coldest nights of that winter, a terrible emergency would ensue. Now, playing into this story is the incredible aspect of it being the first time in U.S. history that a telephone was used to make an emergency call after an accident, essentially our first 911 call in the country. Here to tell this story is Frank Haviland. He's a member of the board of directors of the Tariffville Village Association and a person who has studied this tragedy at length. Now, Frank, we're going to talk about here today one of the worst train accidents I've ever heard about in Connecticut history, and it really was horrible. And I think that to start this off, we should find out the poor people who were on this train, what they were up to. So they had come to Hartford for, I guess, a pretty famous preacher from Massachusetts.
Dwight Moody was well known. He was kind of the Billy Graham of his day. And he used to travel along with his buddy, a singer, and they would do these rallies and have great crowds come. Even in Hartford in January, he was getting 2,000 people per night to come to his revival meetings.
And they had a couple hundred came on this train.
That's right. When you look at the size of the train, it's obvious that there were more than 200 people on the train.
So now they had been to this revival. By all accounts, it was a success, and everybody went away happy. And in fact, you almost could refer to them as revelers at this point on the train going home because they're singing, right?
That's right. They were in a good mood. They walked over to the train station in Hartford, clambered aboard, and it turned out there were 8 passenger cars and a baggage car and a caboose. And that was so much weight that one locomotive couldn't possibly haul that train up and over all the hills in northwest Connecticut. So they put a second locomotive on it, and they put it right behind the first locomotive. So you had locomotive 1, locomotive 2, baggage car, and then 8 passenger cars, and then a caboose.
And just so people can get a sense, I mean, we talk about the old Iron Horse, 2 engines was, if I have it right, 60 tons?
Yeah, the first one was 28 tons, and the second one weighed 32 tons. So they were big, heavy locomotives, but locomotives needed to be heavy to get the traction so that they could pull all those other cars, especially if there was a hill. Railroads don't like hills. They try to go the long way around rather than go up and over the hill.
They leave Hartford, give or take a few minutes, around 9 p.m., and they get to the Tariffville station at around 10 p.m. Did they stop at Tariffville?
Well, they probably stopped in Bloomfield and in Tariffville because there were bound to be a few people that lived there and had to get off. But there's no record of what they actually did. All the stories in the newspaper have got to do with what happened after the accident.
So now, west of the Tariffville train station, a 7-year-old train bridge went over the Farmington River. Now, tell me a little bit about this. This bridge had only been there for 7 years. It was pretty modern.
That's right. Well, it was when the Connecticut Western Railroad put in a line from Hartford to Millerton, New York. They needed another way to cross, and so they put it in a new bridge. The old bridge was long gone.
Now, this was a wooden bridge.
Yeah, it was a Howe truss, they call it. Triangles, it's very common. It has an iron rod that hangs from the top crossbar, and that holds the floor up, and the rest of the beams are big wooden beams that can take the compression to hold that rod up in the air. So it was 160 plus 160, and now you're across the river and you can just go across the marsh.
Now, this was January 15th, a very cold night. In 1878, the way they heated the cars was they had wood-burning stoves in the cars themselves, right?
Yes, that's right. One in each car.
You know, this was considered modern technology, but at the same time, this was kind of dangerous, wasn't it?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, they needed a conductor person in the car to make sure that nobody screwed around with the fire.
Tell me this unbelievable part to this story that I find just amazing. As they are pulling out of the Tariffville station or going through the station, the occupants of the train are singing.
They were singing revival songs. They were redoing some of the things that had happened during the revival meeting in Hartford. And so they're all inspired. I mean, when he turned them loose, they were at the top of their game.
I understood the song was either I'll Meet You at the River or Take Me Down to the River.
I remember reading that in the Hartford Courant, yeah, right. That was the name of one of the tunes that they were singing.
So ironically, they leave the Tariffville station. They're singing this song, I'll Meet You Down by the River. They start to go over this wooden bridge, and the survivors report hearing a sickening groan, is what I remember reading. And just pick up the story.
As they approach the river and the bridge, they start out to cross the bridge, the locomotive 1, locomotive 2, and at some point, the bridge collapses, and the first 2 locomotives go into the river, breaking through the ice. The baggage car goes into the river, breaking through the ice, and then 3 of the passenger cars go into the river. 3 of the 8 passenger cars are now in the river, and it's 10:30 at night. It's dark. There's nobody around. There's no rescue squad. There's no fire department. They had to rescue themselves. There were some employees of the railroad who were there to help, but first they had to rescue themselves.
And on board these cars that had gone into the river were these wood-burning stoves as well.
Thankfully, the river was there to put them out.
Now, isn't it true one of the cars landed on top of the other?
Yeah, the first car went down, and the second car landed on top of it, partly crushing it. So it was the people in the first car that had the worst outcomes. The people in the second car were able to climb out, in part because they weren't fully in the water, although they probably wound up in the water trying to get off, because the bridge wasn't there anymore. And so they had to wade to the shore.
And just to set up the situation so people understand this, you and I were talking about this before we started recording. So the ice was 5 inches thick that night. However, the depth of the river in that area is only to about the waist. So this is like they were walking around in a glass of ice water.
Yeah, right. And, it was freezing cold, and they're soaking wet. And climbing up on the embankment, the land just before the bridge alongside the river was an open farm field. So they didn't have to do much except climb back up and, get out. By that time, the local villagers had heard the commotion, and so some of them started to come out to see what on earth was going on, and they realized that some of these people needed help. They brought people into their own homes to dry off and warm up, and they also took the people who were injured. They somehow managed to get them down into the village center again, where the Thurston House Hotel let them all pile in there and wait for the doctors to arrive with all their bandages and things. It was quite a to-do, but it was all done by amateurs and locals.
Now let's talk about this famous first call of an emergency, using the phone for an emergency. Now, to set this up again, Alexander Graham Bell got the patent for the telephone in the year 1876. This is 2 years later, 1878. So we certainly don't have phones widespread anywhere. In fact, most of the communications, even between railroad stations, was by telegraph more than telephone. So tell me, what do we know about this famous first phone call that was used surrounding a disaster?
It all began with the guy who was sorting the mail in the baggage car. When the baggage car fell in, something snapped and the whole door of the baggage car opened suddenly and fell away. So he was able to scramble out. And his first thought was to call for help. So he ran back to the train station. He was an employee of the railroad. He ran back to the train station and said, "Please send a telegram east and west, we need help." And so the telegraph operator sends a telegram, and when it arrives in the Hartford station, the train station itself was closed, but the wireless operator, the telegraph operator, was still there. They were on duty round the clock, theoretically. And so the message came through. Why the doctor was there, I don't know, but Dr. Pelletier discovered what was going on. And he decided to run down to the drugstore that was at the corner of Capitol Avenue and Main Street in downtown Hartford, because he knew that they had one of these fancy new gadgets called the telephone. And he knew also that the only people were people like himself, doctors, who had signed up early because they saw the immediate value of having such a communication device. Most people didn't know, hadn't thought about it. So he got to the station, he called the telephone operator. There were no dials or anything like that in those days. You just said to the operator, "Please connect me with Louie or Harry or Sam." And he said to her, "Please contact all the doctors on your list and have them go to the train station and bring medical supplies because there's been a terrible accident." And so his call to her is considered the first emergency telephone call ever made, what we now call the 911 call.
Unbelievable story. Now, let's go back for a second to the scene. I understand that they were having to put together some makeshift sleds.
The neighbors were able to get some things out of their barns and in their backyards, but the ice was 5 inches thick. And they were able to pull people out of the water and drag it up on the embankment. These would be the people that for some reason couldn't walk anymore, or maybe even people that had died and they didn't even know it. But they were able to use these things. And in fact, when the rescue trains came from both directions, they were able to walk back and forth on the thick ice.
So now, this is the other loose end of the story now that we need to tidy up. These trains that came in, I think they called one of them at least the Samaritan Special. Tell me about these trains.
Well, we don't really know very much about them. They were quickly cobbled together with a locomotive and probably only one car, maybe two, because they had to bring only a handful of doctors and workmen. I don't know how many people they were able to bring. So they didn't need an awful lot, but they needed to get there in a hurry. Unfortunately, it took a while to put things together, and so they really didn't arrive until maybe 3 hours after the accident, by which time all the ruckus had died down and people were simply waiting for some medical care.
Even in 1878, when we weren't quite as litigious as maybe we are now as a society, there was still a need for an inquiry, and people wanted to be compensated for their losses. This was problematic because they tried to pinpoint, well, what happened, what caused this, and what did we learn?
Well, there was a jury pulled together to try to look at all the evidence and come up to a conclusion as to what exactly was wrong and who's responsible. There were three theories as to what might have happened, but the jury finally decided they couldn't agree But they knew that no matter which one of the three it was the railroad that had the problem. So they kind of didn't have to worry about the technical details. But there were three theories. The first theory was that it was a problem with the bridge. It somehow had some kind of defect or had worn out or something, and so that's why it collapsed. Well, it turns out that bridge was built by a company that was in Springfield, Massachusetts. So they quickly sent somebody down to take a look at the bridge. And even though it was all smashed, they were able to look and see that the timbers, which had been part of the bridge, were in perfectly good condition. Some of them had been broken because they got hit by a locomotive, but the wood was in good condition. The iron rods, which were a key thing, they were in good condition. So they said, we don't think it was our bridge. I said, on top of that, the bridge is only 7 years old. They last a lot longer than that typically. And the trains have been going over it a couple of times a day for 7 years. And nothing went wrong. So we don't think we're at fault.
So now option 2 was maybe there was a derailment?
Yes, the second option was they discovered that in the front little wheels of the locomotive number 1, there was some jammed in timbers of the original bridge structure, and they thought, aha, maybe the locomotive jumped off the track and crashed into the framework of the bridge, weakening it to the point of collapse, and then it fell into the river. The converse was, maybe when the locomotive fell into the river, it simply landed on one of the broken pieces of the bridge. So we couldn't figure it out.
And then a third option was because, as you said earlier, they had to put the two engines right at the front together, creating 60 tons of weight, that maybe that was just too much.
That's right. Amongst the amateurs, that was the most popular theory, but the jury never bought into it. They didn't have to, is really what happened. The point was the two locomotives were on the bridge at the same time, and maybe that was just too much. There was no engineering analysis to figure out how many tons the bridge could actually theoretically hold. So now you got 60 tons of locomotive, plus a baggage car, plus a couple of the smaller cars, and so it was like, holy smoke, that does seem like a lot. The conventional practice was to put the second locomotive at the end of the train behind the caboose, and you had plenty of propulsion to climb the hills. This, for some reason, wasn't done that way.
To me, one of the more amazing parts of this story is that they pulled the engines out of the water and put them back into service, number one. And number two, they rebuilt the bridge and things went back to normal. I guess I would have found it very difficult to ever go over that bridge again.
Well, the people who buy tickets on the railroad don't know where the railroad is going, and they don't know which bridge is which, and was this the bridge that broke last year? The cleanup and taking the things out of the river was a major, major project which took them many days. And the reason was there was no such thing as a hoist or a crane. They had to do it all with a block and tackle. So pulling the baggage car was probably easy, but the passenger cars would be next, and you had to hook onto them and pull. And what could you pull with? A bunch of men? A couple of horses? That's all. And so it was a real problem to drag them out of the water and drag them up onto the farm field and then somehow right them and put them back on a track so you could pull them away again. It was a great project. There was no crane until 1883 when the first company in Michigan started selling a steam-powered railroad-mounted crane for doing exactly what they needed to do in Tariffville. But it was 5 years too late.
Well, the railroad did have to pay out some claims because of the accident, but frankly, it really wasn't all that much. The 13 families who lost loved ones in the wreck got between $200 and $600 each. Now, Frank has done the calculations, and in today's dollars, that would have been between $7,000 and $20,000 each. For those who were injured, including severely and permanently scarred from those wood-burning stoves, well, they received nothing. That wraps up this episode of Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path. You know, part of Pastor Dwight Moody's speech at the Hartford Revival that night was a bit like a premonition, and I quote this line: "Repentance is grabbing your bag and coat and getting off the wrong train and onto the right one." I want to thank our guest for today's program, Frank Haviland. He's a member of the board of the Tariffville Village Association. The answer to this week's trivia question, the question was, his name was Moses Yale Beach, and he created something you make use of every day. What is it? The answer? The Associated Press. It's a news service that brings you, believe it or not, the bulk of the news that you consume every day. Doesn't matter what your source is for news. Every outlet uses the AP. Next week on Amazing Tales CT, how this Wallingford native rose up to own one of the largest newspapers in the world and then found a way to get news delivered faster than any of his competitors. Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path is a production of True North Associates, LLC. This is Mike Allen. Be safe and please stay healthy.